Before the COVID-19 crisis, there was the Farm System Reform Act, which would prohibit new large factory farms. And it was introduced in part by New Jersey Senator Democrat Cory Booker, who joins us now to not only talk about that, but one of the key issues everyone's talking about, which is stimulus and putting unemployed people back to work. Senator, thank you for joining us here on Yahoo Finance.
It's great to be on. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the stimulus package because it's $3 trillion. That's the proposal. Nancy Pelosi says it's just a negotiation. And then you have Lindsey Graham in the Senate, your colleague, saying dead on arrival. What's this finally going to look like at the end?
Well, the good news is, as Washington can sometimes be disconnected, Republicans and Democrats are actually running things. The Governors Association, for example, has said in a unified bipartisan call, we need help for states. They've asked for over $500 billion in direct resources to prevent the mass layoff around our country of first responders, firefighters, police officers. And so the more you're starting to see people that are out there actually trying to solve problems every day from both parties ask for support, I think it's going to be more likely that things will actually get done here in Washington. So the disconnect between the nature and the level of this crisis and its ongoing nature that seems to not have fully penetrated down here in Washington, I think we're going to get over that and get something more done. You heard Chairman Powell today even talk about the need for more stimulative efforts on the federal government side. So I'm pretty confident that there's going to be some movement down here soon enough.
Senator, it's Julie Hyman here. It's good to talk to you. Why not just give people more money? Sort of dispense with the this for this, this for this, this for this. Just give everyone in the U.S. $2,000 or $5,000 or $10,000 and sort of dispense with all the complexity here.
Well, look, I was one of the leaders in the first CARES Act of a small group of senators that really called for just that, having predictable tranches of direct payments going out to people. If you look at all the analysis of what that does, because it goes to people making under a certain amount of money, and it has a massive stimulative effect to our economy. These are people that will spend it. About 80% of New Jersey families had got the first tranche. And I said to make it predictable. So if the economy is still at X point, it triggers another tranche of those payments. So I think that that's good, but we should also be doing what we've done in other crises, from 9/11, where we had a massive federal mobilization, to World War II, where we had a massive federal mobilization. There are specific things and work that we need to be investing in, because when you compare ours to other countries, whether it's 5% of the globe's population and we're closing in on a third of the globe's cases, or the fact that we are not even in the top 20 of countries who are doing in terms of testing per capita, these are really problematic things that are really going to undermine our economic well-being as well as our health. And so I'm just a big believer, as a guy who actually ran a big city, that you make smart investments, you cut where you have to, but you try to leverage change. And that's something we just aren't doing enough of right now from the federal government. And we're leaving a lot of our localities as if we're still being governed under the Articles of Confederation, a loose assortment of states all fending for themselves. And that's unacceptable.
Senator, in regards to stimulus, one of the things we keep hearing from Republicans is we will not bail out mismanaged states. And I'm curious, it's a two-part question. Why do Democrats take that on the chin when some of the states which are most a mess were controlled by Republicans? Illinois, their pension system is an awful mess. Kentucky. Why do Democrats not fight back on that issue? And will this stimulus package, do you see it restoring the deduction for state and local taxes?
I'm very happy on the state and local tax restoration that the House bill did do that. It's crazy that we balanced, we passed Donald Trump's tax plan and had states pay for it through state and local, giving up their state and local tax deductions, often states that contribute the most to the federal government and get the least back. So I'm hoping on SALT. But look, as far as the other issue you brought up, I mean, there's a ridiculousness in that accusation, which is, hey, we have states that have massive revenue falls. We're not giving states anything to balance out their pensions or what have you. We're giving states things to stop the hemorrhaging from their revenue losses and their expenditures going up. And so for these like wild accusations about state management, no, this is a national crisis that is now putting the United States at a risk after trying to help private corporations like the airlines save themselves from having to do massive layoffs. Are we now going to turn around and say to our firefighters, our police officers, our teachers, and more that we're going to let you lay off those people? We're not going to be there for them at the very time that we need those people in our country out there doing that important work. So this is a lot of political wild rhetoric. And again, I just get back to managing this country and talking to the people that actually run stuff and are responsible where the rubber hits the road. And it's nice to hear bipartisan voices speaking sense to people down here in Washington about getting their act together and making sure we're making the strategic investments we need as a nation, not just to get through this, but I'm a competitor. I want to show the world that American ingenuity, American might can get through this and set an example for how it's done. And unfortunately, right now, we're just not doing that.
Senator, you just introduced a bill along with Senator Warren banning or calling for a ban on factory farming practices at these meat processing facilities. And I'm wondering what direct conversations you've already had with the likes of Tyson or Smithfield Foods. And do you get the sense that there's an acknowledgement on their end that these practices need to change?
Well, I mean, gosh, the acknowledgement you hear from them crying for help is pretty extraordinary. You know, when you see a lot of the meatpacking plants upping their exports to places like China and doing it at the risk of Americans' health and well-being. Our food systems are massively broken in America. I went out to the Midwest a couple of years ago to meet with Republican farmers who all were saying the same thing. The monopolistic practices of these large multinational corporations have driven down their ability to make a living. In fact, the consumer dollar that we spend when we buy our groceries or our food, the farmers have seen a precipitous drop. About 50% of the consumer dollar no longer goes to them. It's being gobbled up by these monopolistic firms that are also doing this large-scale corporate agriculture that's destroying our ecology, putting animals in conditions where we're overusing antibiotics because our heritage is never raising animals in these big factory farms, and hollowing out rural America because you see the loss of family farmers in this country in extraordinary ways. And this kind of agriculture is a threat to our farmers, to our environment, to our economic well-being, as well as to consumers. And we're already seeing that in this crisis. So I have very little tolerance for people who don't believe in the free market. And the fact that things like the Packers and Stockyard Act that helped us to have generations of farmers be able to resist this over corporate consolidation, the fact that we ignore that now and have allowed 4 major companies to just gobble up every aspect of these systems is just unacceptable to me. And as a guy who believes in the free market capitalism, it's such an affront to all the principles that we preach and we say that we believe in.
Senator, it's Julie again. How do you balance the needs that you're talking about, whether it's ecology or animal welfare or the needs of these small family farms, with the enormous appetite for meat? Because just the way animal biology works, right? You can, if you're going to raise animals in what is viewed as a more humane, ecological manner, you can't raise as many of them, right? You can't produce as many of them. So how do you balance that?
Well, first of all, remember, our parents' generation, we didn't do farming this way. We were able to produce and meet the demands of our nation. Also, no, companies like Smithfield, I think they're now majority Chinese owned, they're now literally producing massive amounts of animals, not for American consumption, but to allow these massive agro-businesses. And I've gone down to some of these pig farms and looked at these massive lagoons of manure that pollute rivers and streams and drinking waters. I've visited with communities that can't even open their windows anymore, put their clothing out on the line. The values of their land has gone dramatically down because of these massive multinational corporations that base these toxic industries in our country and then export the goods overseas to countries that don't have to tolerate that level of pollution and abuse. So this is not about feeding America's need for meat. This is about a perversion of the industry that now is putting workers at risk, putting our ecology at risk, and putting our economy at risk as well. It's interesting. New York Times had this great article today about how small farmers are actually starting to do well in this because they're not doing massive monocrops and they're connected to communities, and it shows a way to sort of resurrect our industries. And my bill actually calls for putting billions of dollars directly to farmers, helping them transition to more sustainable efforts that actually treat them with better profits and better well-being and help our ecology. There's a much better way to go. And I looked down here in Washington as a guy who came down here, and I was stunned that over 90% of our ag subsidies go to a few monocrops that often our other branches of our government tell us we're eating too much of this and not going to help develop a more diverse, sustainable, economically empowering to farmers food system. So we have such a broken food system. And as a guy that lives in Newark and walks often into a bodega and sees my kids who can buy a Twinkie product cheaper than an apple, and we're subsidizing so much of that Twinkie, which then raises diabetes rates in our country. We have a perverse system that's hurting farmers, hurting end consumers, hurting our environment, and not making us resilient to crises like this. Because I hate to make a prediction to you, because I led the bill on those wet markets that have often been the source of a lot of viruses. Well, let me tell you, when you pack these massive corporate ag businesses where they're packing more and more genetically modified chickens and pigs into an environment, they have to start injecting them with the literally more than half of our antibiotics are being used just to keep the animals from getting ill. Well, these are breeding grounds for resistant viruses and diseases that are resistant to antibiotics that threaten us in our public health in serious ways. We've seen this in other countries with diseases spreading through cows and the like. We are at risk in our country. We're hurting farmers, hurting consumers, hurting our environment in the process. There's a better way to go by investing directly in farmers and helping them to get out of these situations. I mean, God, the life of contract farmers right now is so dire, where they're living on these horribly in debt, and really more like a sharecropping model, while these corporations, Tyson's and Cargill and others, make so much profits off of them in their international corporate conglomerates. So this is just common sense. And the great thing about it is, as my visits in the Midwest have shown, Republicans, Democrats, all know that this is a broken system. This pandemic has revealed it even more so, and I'm going to fight every day to see if we can make common sense changes.
Senator Booker, it's Brian Chunky. You mentioned Chairman Powell over at the Federal Reserve at the beginning of this conversation, and he was saying this morning that, yes, it is something to be paying attention to, the debt to GDP ratio and how much the government is spending, but he said now at the unprecedented time, now is not the time to prioritize considerations like that. And I'm in New Jersey, and that's actually a Nets jersey behind me.
All right.
And, we're concerned in Morristown or in Denville that, the local shop, the local bakery won't reopen. That's what Chairman Powell was saying, that those types of business closures and people being on the sidelines for a long amount of time can do some serious long-term damage. That means we won't have a V-shaped recovery. So how is Congress thinking about just the number that they're spending here? And do you think there has been a paradigm shift in how much the government is willing to spend, even at the cost of having maybe an eye-popping deficit?
So, Brian, first of all, just a personal comment. Your hair looks too perfect for a pandemic. I mean, I don't understand. Do you live with somebody?
My mom gave me a buzz.
Your mom gave you a buzz. I mean, I've got, dear God, man, you're supposed to be looking grizzled right now and unkempt. You look, I'm just very jealous. I'm sorry. That was a personal swipe, but you're a Jersey boy like me, so I know you can handle it. But secondly, yeah, your point and Powell's point are right on. I mean, the wealthiest country on the planet is not doing as much as other nations are to give people a floor during this crisis. And I talk to Americans all across my state who spent their lives building a small business that is now being wrecked by this crisis. They're in financial distress. They can't pay their mortgage. They're worried about the future. We could take that stress and strain off of them by just doing basic things in this period to keep them afloat, because those small businesses have always been, we saw this coming out of the Great Recession, the main drivers to job creation and job growth if we can help to bridge them and sustain them. This is not the time to be thinking small. During the Great Depression, we built everything from the Hoover Dam to the Empire State Building. This is actually a time to be doubling down on those kind of investments that create a multiplier of growth in our economy. Heck, we on the East Coast, you in Jersey, China's built 18,000 miles of high-speed rail recently. Our busiest rail corridor in North America that goes from Boston to DC and through Jersey, I'm not exaggerating, runs half an hour slower than it did in the 1960s. This is the time to be building those tunnels under the Hudson, relieving the congestion that I can show you a balance sheet analysis return $2 to $3 for every dollar you invest to our economy. And making those investments is not only smart, when interest rates are so low, money is so cheap, this is the time that we should be making the kind of investments that could ripple out into our economy, make us even stronger when we emerge out of this. And that's what that's what common sense calls. And the hypocrisy for some Republicans in the Senate now to be suddenly turning into deficit hawks when they stood on the Senate floor, and I watched in awe as they lied to the American people and said their Trump tax plan would pay for itself through economic growth, when our corporations were not even asking for a 21% rate. They were asking for a 25% rate, but hey, said, let's go further, for crying out loud. For them now, after blowing massive holes in our deficit before this crisis, to suddenly turn around when the American public needs help, when businesses need support, where we need jobs, for them to suddenly say, no, we can't do that, is absolutely ridiculous and hypocrisy of a magnitude that I haven't seen in a town that often is pretty good for some hypocrisy. So this is the time for America to show the world that when the chips are down, we build, we grow, we invest, and we lead. And the leadership is lacking right now on the federal level. And I just think all of us in America, with our pride up, should be saying this is the time that we do the things like our generations past did when they built the Hoover Dam, a project they said it was impossible to do. It's time for us to do some impossible things again and build in America.
And on that vein, Senator, you were mayor of Newark. You know what it's like to deal with a city which has seen a massive flow of people leave. There is this concern that the major metropolitan areas of the country, over time, it won't happen immediately, will lose population because of COVID-19. So those debates that you're going to have in the Senate over how to allocate these funds, won't that be an issue? And what worries you most about this potential outflow from New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Dallas?
Well, Adam, just a small correction. I actually was one of the leaders that helped to change the trend in New Jersey. 60 years of losing population in Newark, and now it's going through its biggest population growth that we've seen since, I think, before you and I were alive. And we did it by making really good investments and strategies, built our first new hotels in 40 years, or built our first new hotels in decades. And it, literally, as I was leaving to become a United States Senator, 1 out of every 3 building permits in New Jersey, commercial residential development, was going on in my city. So I actually think that the livability of cities in America will always be a draw, and that our cities are economic engines that are undervalued. And in fact, if you were making a strategy, I've worked with Brookings on this since I was a mayor, if you were making a strategy for what is our strategy to have the best decade ahead of us of growth, you would double down on investing in cities. And let me tell you, there are things that are so common sense. For example, this pandemic has revealed national security issues with our supply chain vulnerabilities. Why is it from our swabs to our penicillin, we are overly reliant on other nations on basic stuff? You know, I have a bipartisan effort going on about dealing with these supply chain variabilities by bringing manufacturing that is critical to our national safety and security back to the United States. It could create tremendous amount of jobs if we started having a startup manufacturing view. So there are common sense bipartisan things that we could do to build upon our strengths. Our cities create the majority of our GDP in our country, to actually build out greater capacity, to have smart cities, which you see a lot of people like Bloomberg and others reimagining what the American city looks like. It's such an exciting possibility with centers of education and research, centers of manufacturing to get going, and to start doing in our rural areas what is really needed there, from our hospitals to our farming systems. There are ways to get out of this that are not the normal left-right sort of debates we have in Washington, but the ways we can move forward that put us in a better position to compete globally, and I'm very excited about that.
Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. Angelique Hamlani used to cover you when you were mayor in Newark. I did too, a long, long time ago. We appreciate your being here on the
Adam,
move.
let
We'll
the
be right
record
back.
know that I complimented Brian's hair. He said nothing about mine. The rudeness on this interview is just
Senator Booker, I can connect you with my mom. She's out in Rockaway.
Oh, right.
Thank you all. We have to go to break.
I'm a Bergen County boy. I love that. Give me your mom's reference. I would love to be a customer.
Will do.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.